Hello, and welcome to this episode of Ruckcast. Ruckcast is your opportunity to listen in on unscripted conversations about cutting-edge Ruckus Wi-Fi and wired networking technology, Ruckus business, and just interesting innovations that impact the computer networking industry today and in the future. Ruckcast is brought to you directly from CommScope Ruckus Education. For more learning opportunities, be sure to log on to training.ruckuswireless.com and view content on our Ruckus Education YouTube channel. Simply search for Ruckus Education on your YouTube homepage. Without further ado, here's your host, Matt Clouda.
Jim Palmer, you're the second CWNE I've had the distinct pleasure of talking to. I want to welcome you to the podcast. Thanks for coming in and joining me. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks for having me.
So do us a favor, same old spiel I give everybody. Tell us who you are and what you do.
So my name is Jim Palmer. I'm a solutions architect for CommScope Ruckus. I've actually only been with the company for 8 or 9 months at this point. I joined late last year. And I work with Mo Williams and Hugh B. Vickers and Jeanette Lee, and we do the solution stuff that all of the CommScope Ruckus people see.
Very cool. So I'm going to give you a self-plug because I've gone through your blog and it's awesome. There's really, really cool information on there. And it's jimswirelessworld.wordpress.com. So if you're interested in that stuff, you should definitely take a look at it and see what Jim has to say, because there's really good information out there. And I've beaten this horse to death at least 50 times. That anybody that listens to this knows that my background is routing and switching. So when I get to sit down and talk to people that have a full-on background in wireless, it's really fun for me, because I get to really learn some different things and different aspects of it. And one of the blogs that I read through and looked at was about surveys. And Brian Harkins, who is one of our instructors, he is also a CWNE. And I believe he helped write that exam. So he's pretty well versed of it. And I'm sure the world's small enough, you two probably know of each other. But we talked about surveys as well. And you put it in really interesting terms to where how distinctly in depth they really need to become. I think it gets half-assed a lot, and it really shouldn't. So, we talk about how the first problem you're going to run into in a network is poor design, right? And I think that's really where that survey centers around. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so. I mean, it starts with the RF in wireless. And so most of the time when we talk about surveys and designs and wireless, it's always about the RF, but there are other things that can happen, after the wireless side that can screw up a wireless design.
Okay, tell me about that. What are those things?
So one of the things that I'm actually pretty well known for is my work with large public venues. And something that we discovered by pure accident at my previous position in a large public venue was we were rate limiting the clients on the wire. So we set limits for all of our guests on our network. And we had, on our busiest day, I think we had 108,000 unique MAC addresses in one day. And it was a big network. And one of the things that we would do is we would say, like, hey, we need to conserve the pipe, because we don't want to have 10,000 devices sucking up all of our internet. So we would rate limit them. And the rate limiter was placed midpoint between where the packet would leave the access point and when it hit the internet. And what we discovered by pure accident one very hectic Friday night right before Thanksgiving was the rate limiters that we were rate limiting the wireless clients on was actually causing our wired network to crash. Yeah. And so it was screwing up the wireless guys because all the wireless clients couldn't get their data. And because we had put the rate limiter in the middle of the wired network, we actually screwed up our wired network as well. And so in a stroke of madness, on a late Friday night, I sent my boss a text and I was like, I'm just going to raise the rate limit from 5 megabits per second per user to 100 megabits per second per user. And let's see if we can cause fire to shoot out of the fiber network cable that was, connecting. I was like, if we're going to go down, let's not go down like punks. I was like, let's because I don't know if you noticed on my blog, but I really don't know much about wired networking. So I had no idea. I was just like, screw it. Let's see what we can do. And so I raised the rate limit to 100 megabits per second, and it actually saved the wired link between our core, one of our core, or the core switch and one of our distribution switches by doing that. And so, yeah, there are things that you can do on the wired side that will mess up the wireless, and wireless is always blamed because, of course, if you had a wire connecting your laptop or your desktop computer to the network, you wouldn't have any of these problems. It's only when we introduce wireless where we have a problem. And yet stuff like DHCP or DNS or, the wrong VLANs or any of these other things that seem second nature to wired people can be messed up by wireless network engineers. And then the wireless gets blamed, even though you can have a pristine RF condition where your RF, you go through and you survey and you're like, yeah, the RF looks great. We map it out. We don't have any co-channel interference. We don't have any adjacent channel interference. We don't have anything. Everything's really clean, but the network's still terrible. And it's because the wired side has been messed up.
So anybody with an operations background knows exactly what that Friday night looked like and the ensuing problems with it. And it's a really interesting thing because, on top of that, anybody with an operations background or really any interaction in these environments in this industry, you know exactly what happens, right? The network is to blame. Well, the network is massive, number one. And the network size you're talking about is extremely massive. I mean, take an airport, for example, right? That's a massive network. So when you look at, rate limiting and things like that, and you put together a very pristine RF environment, how do you offload that rate limiting aspect so you're not burying pipes and offload it off of middle points in the network and offload it back into client to AP? I mean, is that a more realistic place to do that to really save your bandwidth and limit that traffic? Is that a better place to do it, or are there other ways where you should really be doing that? Is the middle of the network still the right place to limit those clients?
So the middle of the network is totally the wrong place to do this because you're introducing something that is artificial, because the wired network could handle it for the most part. And the problem is it's all about the aggregation of the traffic, right? So if you're going to do a rate limit, which I'm very much of the mindset of let people get the data as fast as they can. So in your example of an airport, when we used to fly, you'd be sitting there at your gate going, oh, I'm going to be stuck on this metal tube for the next 3 hours. Let me download some content because I can't stream it on the plane. So you say, I want to get my movie. And you pick a movie that's on Netflix that you can download. And the movie's 1.4 gig, 1.6 gig is the size of the file. And you say, give me that movie. Now, that's a really small request that goes from your client device out to the Netflix server. But then the Netflix server says, okay, I'm going to try to send you the 1.6 gig file that is your movie that you've requested. I'm going to try to send it to you as fast as I can because I need to get you off of my, of taking up my resource. So when you put a rate limiter somewhere between the Netflix server that's sending the content and the client device that's receiving that content, if you're going to do that to try to save it, there's not a great place to put it, to be honest with you, because you still want to get your 1.6 gig file.
Yeah.
And whether it takes you 20 seconds to get that, or 40 seconds, or 20 minutes, then you're still going to be getting there. You're still taking the time. You're using that resource from the client side saying, hey, give me this, send me this data, send me this data, send me this data. And at your house or in a smaller network where you don't have a lot of guests that are doing that, it's masked, it's hidden because you don't see that. But when you have 10,000 devices doing this all at the same time, what ends up happening is you've actually created a denial of service attack that's been instituted by people that you want on your network, the guests, the traveling public. You've now instituted a direct denial of service attack that is being generated by the Netflix servers being targeted at your external IP address.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden, when the the Netflix server sends 50 packets, the TCP window size says, hey, send me 50 packets. And he goes, great. And then you rate limit it and you only send them 3. The client device sends a TCP ACK at layer 4 that says, hey, I only got these 3 packets. And the Netflix server goes, okay, I'm going to send you 47 more. Except those 47 packets are still sitting at your rate limiter. And so so now you have, 94 packets sitting there, that are not needed, the 47 that aren't needed because you already had them there. And so you end up getting this direct denial of service attack. And if you put that rate limiter closer to your WAN edge, out to where your internet connection is, then all of these devices that are doing this, it all gets aggregated at that one point. Now, if you're going to rate limit, put it as close to the client as you can. Put it at the AP level, but then you got to have APs that can handle that type of buffering of, hey, we're going to be saving all this data. Because what happens is there's a probability formula used in telephone networks, Erlang's probability formula B and Erlang probability formula C. And it talks about the probability of people using a random access medium. And it was built for telephone networks way back in the day, when you try to call long distance and you had to have a long distance trunk to get to the next city. And it always worked until Christmas, when everybody wanted to call each other on Christmas or Mother's Day or whatever. And you'd always get that, hey, all circuits are busy.
Yeah.
Well, because something all of a sudden happened that caused everybody to call at the exact same time, which was the day, Christmas Day, Mother's Day, everybody wants to call long distance. But any other time when you just would randomly call long distance, you could oversubscribe the trunk and say, we only need 3 trunks for 1,000 houses, because they're not always going to do that. In a guest network, you have to pay attention to the intent of the devices that are using the network. And this is different than intent-based networking. This is, what do those people want to do? And at an airport, which we might as well come out and say, that's where I worked before, was at an airport. At an airport, everything was very random access. Not every plane came in at the same time. Not every plane left at the same time. People would be there for different lengths of time. And so you always had this random access. So if you could get them onto the network, let them get their 1.6 gig file that you wanted before you got on the plane. If I could get you that file in 20 seconds, you would then go, oh, wow, I have my file. So now for the next couple of minutes, let me look around and see what's the next file that I want to download, because now I'm like, ooh, I can get another one. And so your time that you're putting the greatest demand on the network reduces. And so by having that reduction in demand on the network from a time perspective, it opens up a gap to where your neighbor can be downloading his file. So instead of aggregating devices trying to download files at the same time, you can space them out, which reduces the overall need to have bigger pipes to go buy more internet service from your provider. And so if you're going to rate limit, try to get it as close to the client device as you can. But we've seen it in some testing that if you can remove the rate limit in a truly random access type of scenario, then you actually don't need the rate limiters, and your network will run cleaner, and it'll actually run less than you really think you need.
Yeah. I'm a proponent of rate limiting in the right places. And it's amazing what we'll do. I mean, essentially, we'll almost cut off our own foot to try to win the marathon. Which
exactly.
And sometimes you have to question. And I'm one of those people, right? I sat down one day and I thought, I wonder how many days of my life I've sat in an airport. And then I realized I was asking myself a question that I really didn't want the answer to, so I stopped asking that question. But it's funny how you get into these environments, and in networking, we separate and silo things a little bit, right? Hey, that's our wireless guy, go talk to him. Hey, that's our routing and switching guy, go talk to him. And you end up in this situation where you start rate limiting in the middle, and the network guys are looking at it going, why are we doing this? Because now you're taking all your traffic between your core and other layers of that network, and you're starting to really squeeze it down. And look, wireless isn't innocent in this, right? I mean, wired networks have had their design challenges as well. And the biggest thing that goes into that is organic growth. So you can start to build out a network, and then all of a sudden, a year or two later, you look at it and you go, whoa, this thing looks way different. We need to really go in and look at what's going on here, because the wired network itself has so much responsibility in this, in making sure that traffic is flowing correctly, that if you don't stay on it, you can have the cleanest RF network in the world. It won't matter. The wired network's going to kill you anyways.
Right.
And we've seen that multiple times, and I've witnessed that multiple times, and we've cleaned that up multiple times. There's places for it. There's use cases for rate limiting and things like that. We just are learning over time to be more and more stringent about where it goes, how it's utilized, what the benefits are, and what the cons are too. I mean, you can't look at these networks and say, oh, we're going to go build all this stuff and it's going to run great, because it doesn't always work that way. There are still cons built into that. Right. So,
Well, and especially in wireless, we don't ever get to do anything in wireless that doesn't have a penalty. It's always a balancing act of, to get more throughput, to get those faster speeds that our marketing always talks about, we need to have wider channels. But wider channels means we get to use less channels, and so we have this balancing act of where do we, in the design of a network, where do we have that balance? And what a lot of people either haven't learned or forgotten is that the one critical difference between a wired network and a wireless network is collision avoidance versus collision detection.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, whereas wired networks have kind of overcome that collision boundary, the collision domain with the CSMA CD, wireless network is still really just a big giant hub. And so you have to learn, where do we balance? Where do we, if we're going to do one thing, then it's going to cost us somewhere else. And there's still sort of this balancing act that goes on. And because wireless hasn't been as mission critical to an operational network as long as wired has, everybody's wired network's mission critical. But as we've started moving more and more things to a wireless connection, as wireless engineers, as wireless designers, and I hate using the word wireless experts, because the more you learn about wireless, you're not an expert. But we don't have as much time in the trenches as, say, a wired guy who's like, oh, yeah, I was doing wired networks 25 years ago. Well, Wi-Fi hasn't been around for 25 years for anybody to have 25 years of experience in the traditional Wi-Fi 802.11 as we know it today. So,
come on, man, it was 20 years ago. I'm not that old.
Well, maybe not you, but I've talked to other people that've been like, oh yeah, I've been doing this for 25 years. And so, as a wireless engineer, we're still trying to get some of this institutional knowledge that wired engineers have had, because they've just simply had more time at it. Even 10 years ago, you think about the fact that wireless was still sort of this kind of a nice thing to have. It was kind of cool, but it wasn't necessarily a requirement. And, if it worked, great, but if not, it was just what it was. It was a best effort type of service. And if you think about how fast that's changed over the past 10 years, you go, wow, we, as a wireless, to your point, as wireless engineers, there's been this learning curve that we've had to try to catch up to that already happened on the wired side.
Yeah.
And so, we do bear a lot of responsibility in it.
Yeah. And it's funny that you bring up the term expert, and you bring it up in a very humble manner, right? Because there's a really interesting gap that we're always trying to bridge. And that's whether you work for an education department, that's whether you manage or own a network that you're, building and supporting. There's an interesting gap in trying to cross over from book smart to practical smart, right? Because you're going to see all of these different scenarios. Every day is something different, and they all require different pieces and aspects of it. And you look at this stuff and you realize that foundationally you have an extremely expansive knowledge of the technology. But in the practical environment of it, because it changes and shifts so much and there's so many variables, that closes in on you really fast, and it changes the dynamic of it very, very quickly. to where you have to be able to apply all of the different things at the blink of an eye, and it really is a challenge in those environments. It becomes really interesting to watch happen.
And it's a wireless is such a thing. It's just as much art as it is science, and when I was doing two-way radio work, 20 years ago, people would always ask me, they're like, oh, will it work if I put the antenna here? And, whether it's on a vehicle or in an office or something. And I would be like, I don't know, let's try it, because there's so many different nuances that'll affect it that, it is, there's art just as much as there is science in doing wireless. And it never lends itself to being, something that you ever feel comfortable with. It's that whole learning curve thing of once you learn enough, you all of a sudden you realize, wow, I don't know nearly what I thought I used to know, and the more you learn, the more you learn that there is to learn.
So,
and it's
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, from that aspect, I really like wireless just because I know that I'm never going to get to the point where I go, oh, okay, there's nothing else to learn about wireless and how it works in our world and in our environment.
So I have an interesting thought or question, I guess. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to word this correctly so it doesn't come off as abrasive, because it's really not meant to. When you look at every vendor on the planet has two real intentions, right? They want to create great technologies and they want to have people successfully use those technologies, right? Because that tells its own story. When you look at these wireless environments, has there been more of an effort that you've seen, whether you have seen it or do we need to see that effort, where you put all of this effort into the wireless design? Does there need to be more kind of an open discussion about not only the wireless design, but also that design that's going to tie into the wired network as well? Are you starting to see that more often now?
Oh, 100%. 100. I mean, and to your point, it was something that, 5 or 6 years ago, it was just starting to be that thing. And part of the reason is because the wireless network, with the older protocols and the older chipsets, you always looked at the wireless network and was like, okay, this is where my limitations are. This is where my choke points are. This is where this is. And for the most part, there was a really delineated silo between the wireless and the wired. And so you did have these teams that would sort of sit there and point the finger at each other. But with wireless, as the new protocols have come out, as we've gotten more efficient, most people forget that the latest protocol, 802.11ax, is actually high efficiency wireless. It's not, very high, 802.11ac or Wi-Fi 5, I guess, was known as very high throughput, VHT. But when we went to the next protocol, it wasn't about extremely high throughput or some other type of way to describe throughput. It was about being more efficient, high efficiency Wi-Fi. So as we've gotten the speeds to where they match the wired network, we've now gotten more efficient. And so this silo, these finger pointings that used to be between the wireless and the wired teams, are starting to come down, especially now when we start talking about some of the new things coming out, like microsegmentation. And one of the things that we're working on with CommScope Ruckus is this idea that, microsegmentation, while it was first introduced as a data center concept, does it really have to be that way? Can we move this idea of microsegmentation and having wireless devices and wired devices and IoT devices all work at the edge? And so now all of a sudden, what used to be siloed is now the doors have been kicked down over the past couple of years to where we say, we need to actually do a much better job from wireless and wired engineers, making sure that from a end user perspective, it's a more seamless experience as they move from, having my wireless tablet talking to a wired stereo and talking to my television and my whatever streaming device I'm using, talking to my refrigerator and my my toaster oven. I mean, all of a sudden, we're going, hey, we need all of these devices to talk. Some are wired, some are wireless. And so now we're just by where the devices are going and how people use the devices, we're having to do a better job of doing that. And I think there is some catch up. I mean, we're never going to be, as the people that design these networks, we're never going to be at a point where we're in front of where the devices are taking us, because we don't know where they're taking us. So we kind of have to wait, and then we go, okay, now we have to play catch up. And oh, by the way, our network refreshes, we did a year ago, so it's not in the budgetary cycle for another 3 years. So, good luck.
Yeah, exactly. And we're at the mercy of application development and technology that's going into applications and appliances. And I still, for the life of me, cannot figure out why my refrigerator needs an IP address. Like, why? I don't get it. Like, I'm pretty technically proficient, and I can't find any reason on the planet why my refrigerator needs to be IPv6 addressed. Like, what for?
And and unfortunately, I think as engineers, we're kind of more of the, we think why, because at the same time we're going, and do you know what I have to do to make that happen?
Yeah.
And by the way, I got to secure it, so, and you look at Whirlpool and you go, how good are your network engineers and your network security teams? And you want me to add you onto my and so I think sometimes as engineers, we're a little short-sighted from that perspective, because we also think about what we have to do to make it work. And so we don't think about any of the benefits, because I'm with you. I have no clue. I don't know why.
Just put a compressor and a sealed system in it that's not going to fail in the next 20 years. And sure, put a Wi-Fi radio in it. I don't care. I'm not going to hook it up to anything. And if I do, I'm going to DMZ that thing into a black hole. So have fun with that.
and but that brings up a good point, because you go, great, just throw a Wi-Fi radio in it. But where you put that Wi-Fi radio and where you put that antenna makes a huge difference on how it works, because you get it between a compressor and a pump or some other. I'm not a refrigeration guy, so I don't know all the parts. But you get an antenna in between these motors, and all of a sudden you have an electromagnetic field, and you could put your access point inside the refrigerator and it still wouldn't work. And yet it's the wireless engineers that get blamed for your refrigerator not getting an address.
Exactly.
And we sit there and go, yeah, but you put the antenna in the worst possible place. And so now we have to then work around that, because people go, we're just going to throw a Wi-Fi radio in there because Wi-Fi works. Wi-Fi is great.
Yep.
It works everywhere. Everywhere in my house works great, so I don't have to worry about anything. But there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it to make it work that way. And if people are just throwing Wi-Fi radios into refrigerators and toaster ovens and dishwashers, I'm waiting for the day that the microwave oven comes out with a 2.4 only radio embedded in it. That'll be a fun day.
Oh man. And it's funny too, because you think back, remember your cordless phone when we had landlines and you'd be on the phone and somebody kicks the microwave on, you're like, oh boy, here we go. Yeah. Go ahead. It's just a weird world. That's all I was going to say.
No, but I think that's part of the problem is the wireless network has gotten ubiquitous to the point where you just go, yeah, it just works.
Yep.
Whether it's cell, whether it's CBRS, whether it's IoT running at 900 megahertz, whether it doesn't seem to matter. Everybody just goes, it's in my cell phone. It's this little tiny device that I carry in my pocket, and it just works.
Yeah.
And so they go, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it work here? Why doesn't it work there? And so, I think there's still some education boundaries that we need to, cross before we really get to that point where people really understand, what is it we're asking all of our devices to do? What is it that we're asking our networks to do? Instead of just going, oh, it's wireless, it's all the same, and then you end up with APs that have 5 and 6 radios in it. And then the wired guys go, what do you mean you need 90 watts of power per port?
Yeah. Yep.
And we go, it's not our fault. It's what somebody else is asking for. But as that bridge,
yep, and we got to point the finger at someone.
And as that bridge, between the unseen and that cable, why not point it at us?
Yeah. The biggest thing I ever hear in terms of, and my exposure is a little bit different because I work and interact with our support org quite a bit. And one of the main things I hear is when it comes to wireless and clients and connectivity is people tend to complain about throughput, right? So what is the Jim Palmer CWNE expert analysis on how you look at throughput issues on a Wi-Fi network? If there's no rate limiting or nothing in the middle that's actually crunching your bandwidth, right, or restricting it, what paths do you start going down to say, this is what we need to do to look at throughput and see what makes sense?
So the first question is, where does the complaint come from? Is it somebody who sits there and says, hey, I went to speedtest.net and my throughput was only 250 megabits per second, and yet when I look at the marketing spec sheet for my phone, I was supposed to get 1.3 gigabits per second. So that's really the question where I start with is what is generating the complaint? Because a lot of times, when you understand that that's the only reason they're complaining, it's not that they're suffering any problems. It's not that, I'm on this web call or I'm on this webinar, or I'm recording a podcast and I'm having problems. If the complaint is generated from, I went to speedtest.net and I didn't get 1.3 gigabits per second, at that point you realize it's probably not a technical problem. It's more of an education problem.
Yeah.
Now, there are times when, yes, it is the network. I hate to break it to people, but yeah, sometimes the networks do have problems. But and then at that point, you kind of have to start. It's a divide and conquer is the method I take of saying, okay, where is the problem? Because in order to fix the problem, we got to identify it, and in order to identify it, we got to find it. And so you end up with this idea of, well, is it related to my network? The stuff that I can control, or is the problem out on the internet? Because what I've noticed recently is at home with my ISP, they've had problems where the problem doesn't exist in my home. The problem doesn't even exist between my home and where I connect to them. The problem exists one step beyond that, where I can't route out of their network. And so I'm not a route switch guy, but I'm just sitting here going, yeah, they have a routing problem somewhere upstream. And so at that point, even though I'm having problems doing what I need to do, I've now identified that, hey, you know what, that's outside of my network, outside of my control. And so that's something else. And I have tools that I've put in place in my home network to do that. But in other instances, in other places, it's, especially if they don't have me sitting in their house to build this stuff or somebody else, you kind of have to go, okay, how do we figure out? And so the best way is to do a divide and conquer, go halfway, go to the point where you can last control it. And let's see how our communication works between, the client device, laptop, phone, tablet, desktop, and the point to where we last control. And a lot of network security guys get really antsy when I say, hey, yeah, I'm going to put this little, I have some little testing servers are called WLAN Pies. And it's a group effort from the wireless community that they built these 2-inch cube speed test servers that you can plug in anywhere in your network and actually run a speed test against it. And so at that point, you can go, oh, I am getting 1 gigabit per second between my client device and the edge of my network. So the 250 megabits per second that I'm getting is external to me. And so that way I can redirect my focus. But if I go, oh yeah, I'm only getting this or I'm getting less, and you can then start dividing the network down to say, where does my problem lie? What do I, and then once you figure out where the problem is, whether it's a wired problem, I've seen problems where, the routing tables don't update the same on a redundant system, where it's routed, it gets the upstream packet goes through one router, downstream comes back through another one, and at that point, then you can start isolating it down to where you finally get to the point where it's a wireless problem where you go, oh, we're having problems on the Wi-Fi. And I hate to say it, but half the times those problems can be corrected just by simply looking at the information that we're presented on dashboards. I mean, the smart zone system, I absolutely love because I get to see things on there that is just part of the control system that other vendors you have to pay to get, and you don't get to see it on the same platform.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you start looking at, okay, are there things that I can see from the system's perspective that says I have an RF problem? But the first step is always, let's figure out why they're complaining, and then you have to isolate, if it is a technical problem, where does it live? Because half the times, it's somebody trying to talk out to a server on the internet, and that server could be having problems. It's not our fault that it's slow going to one server, but you go to a different server, out somewhere else on the internet, and it works great.
Right. Yeah, and that's the challenge of it, right? Is you have so many variables in these environments that it's really easy to start pointing the finger. But the beauty of that on the flip side too is, we're fortunate enough to have people like yourself that can not only fix the problem, but educate on the fact that there really isn't a problem. You know what I mean?
And I think the other thing that I'd throw in there is, don't naturally assume that because it's somebody from marketing people, that they don't know what they're talking about. Because I think sometimes we forget that at the end of the day, it's really the end user that matters. I mean, if they're not happy, then that's something that we need to address. And whether that's through education or through technical troubleshooting, there's a reason why that person picked up the phone, and we need to remind ourselves that, they're not doing this just because they don't like us. It's not a personal attack. It's they're having problems. And if they open the attack case, if they call into the support line, they're doing it because they're having a problem and they're looking for help. They're not looking for us to sit there and go, well, of course you're not going to get 1.3 gigabits per second because you're on a 20 megahertz wide channel.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't mean anything to them.
Yep, exactly.
And so that's where, sort of, put yourself in the shoes of the other person and the person that's on the other side and go, okay, why did they get to the point where they were so frustrated that they actually called, or why did they do this? And let's see if we can figure out from their perspective. And by having a little bit of that empathy and understanding that, hey, we really are here to serve that end user, and it makes you a better troubleshooter, because then you sort of say, okay, knowing technically what I know, what would cause the problem that they're explaining? And more importantly, when I fix the problem, what does it look like for them? Because a lot of times they're not asking for 1.3 gigabits per second, and so thinking that that's what we have to deliver isn't necessarily the case. But if you don't ever have those conversations, you don't know. And so you end up spending a lot more time working on things that you don't have to, because that's not what they really wanted.
Right. Yeah. I mean, here's a great example. So I have a home network built, right? So I've got some different things in there, and one of them is a Plex server. So I'm sitting there one day and watching a movie on my Wi-Fi enabled TV that's attached to an access point that has to travel upstairs to this little thing, and it's buffering. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. What's going on here? And the funny thing about that is my first thought was not to blame my wireless network, because I knew that it was something in between the server and the NAS, because there was just something off, and I just had a feeling about it. And maybe that's experience talking, I don't know. But it wasn't necessarily I needed to jump right away to there's an issue with the Wi-Fi. Knowing full well that my Wi-Fi was not placed, or that access point specifically that it was attached to was not placed in the most ideal spot. But I just had a feeling. So of course you start looking, and it's, issues with the NFS mount and how it's attaching to the NAS. So you start to realize, oh, okay, well, you have to make that pipe a little bit bigger to handle all of that traffic. Same kind of windowing idea, right?
Yeah.
So you go through that, and it's really challenging, especially when you look at the support role, where marketing takes and again, we're not bashing marketing. We understand the idea behind it, but you take these very technical concepts and terms, right, and you try to layman them down a little bit so that it makes sense to a common user. For every handful of technically savvy people that are involved with this, you're going to have 3 or 4 handfuls of people that aren't. So you have to be able to speak to both groups, right?
Right.
And you start to put that together. Then in a support world, you're put in a position to where you understand it very technically, but now it's okay. How do I guess water it down a little bit to put it in a layman's terms so that somebody understands it? Because when you talk about a 20 megahertz channel, the 4 handfuls of people are going to look at that and go, huh? I don't know what you're talking about, dude. So that's where you have to kind of start drawing that middle ground. And that really does fall on support, and it falls on engineers to sit down and say, okay, let me find some happy medium to at least elaborate on this so that you understand your network isn't misbehaving. It's not misconfigured, and it's not performing poorly. This is what you should expect, right?
And I complain about it on social media and I think most tech people do, but quite honestly, doing tech support for your family, while it's painful and we all hate it, is actually a really good place to practice. Because they're going to call you and they're going to be like, the latest one over the weekend was my brother and his smart lock. And so I had to try to figure out, how do I remotely help my brother through this, the problems that he's having with his smart lock that he just bought, and it doesn't work the way marketing says it does. And so then we have to kind of go through the whole thing. And so we complain about it, but quite honestly, it's a great place to practice because they're family. So what are they going to do? Fire you?
Right.
And so it does take practice. It does take that experience and that time in the trenches of sort of working through what is the other person going through, what are they seeing, and how do you help them get to that point to where they're happy and they're maybe not extremely happy, but they're at least comfortable with where the solution is left.
Yeah. And my favorite's when you have to call support for something. So I might have talked about this before, but you'll get a kick out of this. We have a security system at home with a video doorbell. Doorbell does not want to behave. Issue after issue after issue. So I get the company on the phone and a support guy, and he's trying really hard, and I know he's working off of a script to a certain level. And he asked me to go stand next to the doorbell and do a speed test. And right then I just stopped him and I said, hey, this is not ego talking, but I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm going to tell you I did it so that you can check it off the list, but you're talking to the wrong person to do that with. Like, there's a different issue. Let's figure the issue out, because this is not a speed test issue. And so we kind of went through it, and he was trying to explain that the doorbell itself, if I had both a 2.4 gig network and a 5 gig network running, then there was a conflict and a problem with it. And I asked him very clearly, I said, well, what kind of antenna and radio is installed in the doorbell? And he said, well, 2.4 gig. And I said, well, then you can erase the 5 gig argument, because unless you have a massive software defect inside the doorbell, or there's a radio installed inside the doorbell, that argument goes out the window immediately. So it's an actual issue with the hardware on the doorbell. And he said, all right, well, I'll send you another one. And he sent me another one, and it came right up. So I'm like, I'm not trying to be that guy, but I'm also not interested in wasting my time or yours. So let's just fix the problem here. You have a faulty piece of hardware. Send me a new one.
Yeah.
So
I think everybody kind of has stories that we can tell about that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've talked about a couple times on the podcast. I've talked about, we're going to get a group of people together and do a war stories recording, because I think there would be some fun behind that. I mean, everybody, and I've been really fortunate in doing the podcast. I've been able to speak to some very, very interesting people like yourself. And that there's stories. I mean, I've got my own stories where I could sit down and talk about it, and, things that went well and things that did not go well, and things you said and things you probably shouldn't have said. And so I think it would be a lot of fun to do that, just because of how much information is really out there in stories. So we'll probably have to put that one together here pretty soon. Yeah,
I could always tell you about the story where I almost got shot by the Secret Service.
Oh, I want to hear this.
You want to hear it now?
Absolutely. Yeah. Everybody wants to hear. You can't start a story like that and then just, oh, never mind, I'm not going to. Come on, you got to tell us now.
All right. So this happened actually at the 2002 Salt Lake Olympics. I was there working the two-way radio support, and I ended up on a team that was assigned to go around to the different venues and check all of the teams' radio gear. And so you got to remember, this is February of 2002, so right after 9/11. Yep. We're in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so that day, the team that I was on, we were assigned to go to the bobsled track. And so we show up to the bobsled track and we have our little passes so we can get in and everything. But everybody had to go through like airport type security with mag and bag. And so I have a laptop case filled with every cable known to man. And I put it on the little thing. And at that point, you didn't have to take your laptop out. You just put your bag on there and ran it through the x-ray machine. And the Secret Service guy running the x-ray machine goes, I have a bag with just a ton of cables. So they flag it, they pull it off to the side, they pull me off to the side. And so we open it up and I'm standing there with some Secret Service agents and they're dressed in uniform and, everything armed to the teeth. And we start going through all the things that I have in my bag. And one of the things I had in my bag was a freak counter. And it would just sniff the air really close around it. And it would tell me the frequency that the radio was transmitting on.
Oh, no.
And I was trying to explain this to the Secret Service agent. He had no idea. And because another aspect of the Olympics is every transmitter that happens at, that's at the Olympics has to be certified for use because you're transmitting and there's so many transmitters. Everything has to be coordinated.
Yeah.
And so every transmitter had a sticker on it. But if it was a receiver, it didn't need a sticker. Well, my receiver didn't have a sticker, but it also had this antenna on it. And the Secret Service agent knew enough that he knew that anything with an antenna needed to have a sticker. And so he kept pestering me and he's like, and I kept trying to explain it to him. And I was, this is 18 years ago. So I wasn't quite as intelligent as I am now or learned. and I also was a little more snarky than I am now, if you can believe that. And so I was like, fine. I said, let me show you. And he goes, what do you mean? And I go, well, just key up your radio. So he keys up his radio and I hold my freak counter next to it and I push the button and it decodes the frequency. And he pulled his gun on me and he was like, what are you doing? And I was like, whoa. Well, the guy I was with, right? He had this giant roll of all access transmitter stickers on him. So he comes over to save me and he starts stickering everything. And he even puts a sticker on my forehead. And he goes, look, we're part of this is what we're doing. He goes, it's not. But yeah, the Secret Service guy had no idea. But the fact that I could pull the frequency that he was transmitting on just scared him to death. And so he thought that I was some type of terrorist. And so there's a lot of unknowns around that. And so now I know not to demonstrate stuff to harm guards. But so that's how, but yeah, so yes, I was for a short period of time, I was an approved transmitter on a Salt Lake City Olympics venue.
Well, I guess the only way I could really respond to that appropriately is you live and you learn,
Like no good story ever starts with, so I was just sitting there doing nothing and decided to stop, to stay doing nothing. I mean, everything's got to be like, well, what if we did this?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh boy, that's hilarious. Oh
yeah,
man.
And that's also it was that same day where I learned that sometimes as technology people, we forget that people don't rely on technology all the time. Because I went to like some Eastern European bobsled team and I was like, I need to see your radios. And the coach looks at me and he goes like, well, what do you mean radios? And I was like, well, the radios that you use to talk on. And he goes, we don't have any radios. And I said, well, how do you talk to the start house, at the top of the hill where they put the bobsled on the track? And to this day, I remember this clear as day. The guy turns around and he looks up at the start house and he cups his hands around his mouth and he goes, hello. And I went, you got me.
Got me.
I was like, "Yep, you don't need technology," and I just shook his hand and walked away.
He's probably thinking, leave me alone, nerd.
Yeah. Yeah. So we rely on technology, but some people actually don't.
Yeah. Oh man, that's hilarious. Jeez. Oh, too funny. Jim, I want you to come back and do this again. This has been I mean, I'm sure there's more war stories. And I'd love to keep talking to you. Unfortunately, I gotta go because I have another call coming up. But let's do this again, because this is not only informative and educational. And I mean, like I said, I'm really thankful that we're surrounded by people like yourself that have this knowledge, but not only have the knowledge, but share the knowledge, right? And I can't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've had a good time. It's been fun.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So yeah, you're coming back. You've got an open invite, so I can't wait to talk to you again. And yeah, we'll go from there.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon, and hang in there. I know it's a weird world right now, but just stay safe and healthy, and we'll share some more war stories soon.
You as well.
All right, bud. Thanks. All right. See you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Ruckcast. If you just found us for the first time, be sure to follow or subscribe on your platform of choice so you can be notified of future episodes. If you have ideas for future episodes or can't find Ruckcast on your favorite platform, contact us at ruckcast@comscope.com. And as always, thanks for listening.